Today, I'm really excited to have Dr. Stan Beecham here with me from Roswell, Georgia, a sports psychologist and leadership consultant. Legendary coach Vince Dooley gave Stan his start as an undergraduate student at UGA, allowing him to work with Kevin Butler, the great college and professional kicker for the Chicago Bears. Dooley later hired Dr. Beecham to start the sports psychology program for the athletic department, and he was instrumental in helping UGA win numerous individual and team championships during his tenure. Today, his work with collegiate, Olympic, and professional athletes from many sports has provided him with an insight into the minds of great competitors that only few have had the good fortune to gain. Dr. Beecham has also taken his wisdom into the business world as he develops and creates leadership development programs for corporate clients, and is the author of one of the best books that I've read in a very long time called Elite Minds, Creating the Competitive Edge, which we're going to be talking about today in this episode. So hi Stan, I am so glad I came across your book when I did, and it's really fantastic to have you here with us today.
Well, it's good to be with you, and I appreciate you having me on.
Today's topic is the fascinating subject of psychology, but this is really nothing to do with your clients or how to make them buy stuff off you. This is more about the psychology as a business owner and our attitude and how it affects your future success. I know some people might be thinking to themselves something like, what does sports psychology have to do with creating a successful photography business? After reading the book, the answer seems very clear to me, but can you give us a quick rundown of how you found sports psychology to be applicable to the business world?
Well, I look at it as most of us in business, we have to perform in a competitive arena. In other words, there are people who are trying to do what we do better than us. And if you take that to an extreme, they want to do it so well that they have all the business, which means that you're out of business. And so that competitive tension, if you will, is the same whether it be sport or business, in that how do you get you and your people that work with you to perform at their best? And it's been my experience that most of us have a couple of things that get in the way that hinder us from functioning at our full potential. And so basically that's kind of what my life's work has been, is to work with people to help them get to their best.
In a sense, then, business has a lot of parallels with sports in so much as the attitude that there are winners and losers in business, essentially. I got the business, you didn't, that kind of thing.
Sure.
And, and I'm successful and you're not, so I must be better than you. But we'll come to some of these ideas later on. But how much of someone's ultimate success in business do you think is based in what they do, day-to-day stuff, as opposed to how they think?
Well, for me, there's no difference. It's all one and the same. I know a lot of people try to separate, the mental part of something from the physical doing or action or behavioral part of it. I don't think that's how human beings function. I think the mental processes that we have, whether it be thought or cognition or emotion, are direct related to what we do and how well we do it. Even though I think it's pretty popular to think of, how much of something is mental versus how much of something's physical, I see it as all one piece, in that the things that we believe, the things that we hold as true, generate a certain type of thought and emotion which directly drives what we do and how well we do it.
What you're saying then is that if there is something that's not quite right in the way that we think or the beliefs that we have about how the world functions or how we're supposed to function in the business world, then that can cause problems in the actual actions that we take or don't take.
Right. It's all the same thing. So if you have a belief system that's inaccurate and you have thoughts that are detrimental or inaccurate or negative, you're not going to be able to perform at your highest level.
As a sort of a practical example, that might be, let's say, a photographer who gets into wedding photography, but deep down they really think to themselves, well, I'm not really that good at this yet. So that kind of feeds into the end result where it becomes almost a self-fulfilling thing. They end up not being as successful at it because they believe they weren't going to be successful at it to begin with.
That's a common theme with all the people that I work with, whether it be sport or business. And you're kind of pointing out what I think is one of the two fundamental beliefs. And the first one is, am I good enough versus do I need to get better, or is there something wrong with me? What I've noticed is even people that function at a pretty high level still hold the belief that they're not good enough or that they need to get better. And so part of what I try to help people understand is how did they develop that fundamental belief about themselves? Are they good enough or not? Where did that come from? And then is it accurate? And what I find is that, right now, today in the United States, we live in a culture where it's kind of an epidemic of not enough, not good enough. And it has a pretty significant detrimental effect on people's performance. What's interesting is that when you talk with people about that and you suggest to them that they are good enough, they really want to argue with you about that because they feel like, well, if I think that I'm good enough, then I'm going to quit getting better. If you believe that you're enough, then what will happen is you will become complacent and you will lose your edge. And I find that not to be the truth at all. I think that when we believe that we're enough and that we're good enough, it allows us to perform at our best. It allows us to take some risks that we normally wouldn't. And so I think that's a really critical piece for most people, because when they sit with themselves, they realize, I don't think I'm good enough. Which leads me to is, what determines our value? And for most people, certainly Americans, they think that they determine their own value, their own worth. And I strongly disagree with that. We're kind of taking off on a really philosophical, concept of self-worth. But, what I would suggest to your readers is to, number one, become aware of what is that fundamental belief about self? Do I think I'm good enough or not? And where does that come from? And what ultimately does determine my worth and value? And what I'm suggesting is that our own opinion of our worth and value is not the true answer. It's not what our worth and value is.
Let's take an example of a portrait photographer.
Okay.
And they are sitting there with this impression in their mind that, well, maybe they're not quite good enough. And we all know that there's always room for improvement. But that idea that I'm not really good enough makes them wonder that whether they're capable of doing what they're doing, for one thing. But it also feeds into how they think other people value what they do. Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, so if my value of myself is low, I'm going to project onto other people that they have that same belief about me. In other words, if I don't think I'm good enough, I think that you think I'm not good enough.
Right.
If you take something like photography, which is, I'm not a photographer. I walk around with an iPhone like everybody else and take pictures all day long. But what I would suggest to you is that photography, it's a skill. In other words, the more you do it, the more time you spend in your craft, the better you get. So the improvement happens not because you want to be better. The improvement, the development, the growth happens because you're doing the task, which in sport we would call practice. In sport, we'd say if you practice, if you work out more, you'll perform at a higher level. So if you take someone who's a photographer and that's their living, what I would suggest is practice your trade. In other words, go out and take a lot of pictures in a lot of different situations and use different, techniques, if you will. That's how you get better. And the person who loves photography the most is going to spend more time doing it. And because they spend more time in their trade, in their craft, in their art, they get better at it. Mm-hmm. But you see how that has really nothing to do with your opinion of yourself. It has everything to do with the amount of time and energy that you spend and your willingness to, to put yourself out there and fail. In other words, try something that doesn't work and keep trying things.
Yeah.
This is a belief that most people have about people who are really good is we believe that they're good because they don't mess up. What I found is just the opposite to be true, that people who really develop expertise, they've developed expertise because they were willing to try something that didn't work, but they didn't judge themselves negatively because of it. They said, okay, I just learned something, and what I learned is don't do it that way because it won't work, and then they try another way. So because of their willingness to practice, their willingness to try, their willingness to take risks, that's how they get better. That's how they become an expert.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have a commensurate belief with failure at something as almost as if it's a final failure.
Right. We view failure as something that you should try to avoid, and we see failure as fundamentally a bad or negative thing. What I'm suggesting to you, if you're trying to develop expertise, if your intention is to improve your skill as a photographer, the way that you're going to do that is by failing, is by doing things that didn't work out, which leads you to what is ultimately going to work out. That's the essence of experience, I think, is to take multiple attempts with the realization that the majority of them may not work out the way that you intended, but that's not inherently a bad thing or something that should be avoided. In fact, it's the opposite. It's something that you should seek. Okay, so if you get to a point in your craft where you're not experiencing failure, then I would suggest that you're not taking enough risk, that you're not pushing yourself that really what you're doing is protecting yourself. And so this goes back to this concept of if I believe fundamentally I'm good enough and I'm okay, that will allow me to take risk and ultimately fail. So the fact that I tried something and failed, it doesn't change my value or worth as a person or as a photographer. You see, that's why it's so critical that that piece is intact.
One of the early points that you make in the book is we do what we think we are capable of, and we don't even attempt the things that we think we're incapable of. And so, again, to put that into the context of photography as a business, that might be, let's say, somebody who's just starting out and maybe they've tried taking a few photographs of, their friends' kids and that kind of thing. But then in order for them to know that they have to grow the business, they're going to have to go out there and start to photograph the kids of people they don't even know. They're going to have to basically make an instant rapport with kids that don't know them, that are unfamiliar. And they might feel like, well, I don't feel capable of doing that right now, and it stops them. What can they do to get over that?
When you were saying all that, what came to my mind was a conversation that I had a couple of weeks ago when I was in Southern California, and I was down at the beach, and there was a bunch of guys in the water surfing, and I was standing next to this guy who was taking a lot of pictures and had a lot of equipment, and I kind of assumed he was a professional photographer, and he was, and so we had a brief conversation. But basically what he told me is I'm going to take a couple of thousand pictures, and I'll get 2 or 3 that I'll be able to use. And he wasn't troubled by that at all. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
What he's saying is the way you take a good photograph is by taking 1,000. And when you take 1,000 photographs, you're going to have a couple of good ones.
Right.
If he was troubled by the fact that most of the photos he wouldn't even use, then there's no way he could stand out there and take them. Mm-hmm. So I think what happens for a lot of people when they begin something is they immediately try to do it perfectly without error. And what I'm saying is the intention of not messing up, of not making a mistake, will keep you from doing it, whatever the it is. You follow me?
Yeah.
So people who have developed expertise, what they have developed is the ability to, say for a photographer, is the willingness to take a lot of photographs that you're not ever going to use or no one else is ever going to see.
And going back to that example just now of the guy photographing the surfers, you mentioned he'll take 1,000 photographs and expect maybe 2 or 3 really great ones to come out of that.
Right.
I just want to make the point that this is not a random thing that we're talking about here. It's not like, well, he just took 1,000 images in the hope that 2 or 3 would come out, because you could literally put the camera there on a tripod by itself and just put it on some sort of automatic thing and just walk off and leave it.
Sure.
And come back and you'd have maybe, well, you would hope maybe you'd have 2 or 3. But what's going on and what's happening while he's doing that is that continual practice of taking photograph after photograph after photograph is training his inner eye.
That's right.
There's part of his subconscious that is then able to recognize the great image when it happens and when it presents itself.
That's right. And keep in mind, he's not trying to take 1,000 great photos. He's trying to take one. He realizes the way that you have a great photo is that you take 1,000. So what I'm saying is, so here's someone who does this professionally and does it quite well. If you compare that to someone who's relatively new, what I find is when people starting out is they get much more frustrated with failure than someone who has expertise. So I would venture to say a relatively new photographer would take 1,000 photos and only have a couple of them that he's happy with. But he would view that as a bad thing, whereas the expert doesn't. You see the difference?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really one of how do you do something really well. And so amateurs tend to think you do things really well by not messing up. Experts tend to think you do things really well because you have a willingness to mess up. But it doesn't stop you. It doesn't discourage you.
I quite agree. And things in business are not always a smooth ride. There's a lot of bumps in the road and things get tough sometimes. There's always an uphill battle with something. And a lot of folks, they start out with the best intentions in the world of making a success out of their business. And then the tough times hit and things don't go their way. And so they come up with excuses. And we all do this. We come up with these excuses that justify changing our intention and setting an easier route or something like that. That may not be a good thing, depending on the goals that you want for yourself. But what can we do to protect ourselves against that kind of thing?
Well, I think the process of making the excuse is just that. It's an attempt to protect yourself. So what I would suggest is if you want to develop expertise at something, you can't protect yourself. You have to be willing to be vulnerable. And so when you do something and you do it poorly, you say to yourself, I didn't do that very well. You follow me?
Yep.
Versus, well, there's nothing wrong with me. It's someone else's fault or some situation's fault. So just the whole concept of making excuses is really an attempt to protect self. And so what you find out is that people who have a lower image of themselves, who aren't as emotionally immature, they're going to make more excuses because they feel like they have to defend and protect themselves. Mm-hmm. If you accepted the fact that my success and failure is going to be based primarily upon my own willingness to stay in the arena, yes, there are environmental things that affect all of us. The economy, for a photographer, I imagine the weather. There's probably an infinite number of things that ultimately affect your performance. But the reality is that's true for everyone. So in that sense, it's a level playing field in that everyone has to overcome a number of adversities to be successful. Again, one of the things I see with successful people is they accept that that's part of the game, that adversity and failure is part of the game. So when it happens, they don't wish it away or tell themselves it's not fair. They just say, okay, that's how I'm going to get there.
This is one of my favorite parts of the book, actually. You talk about the marathon monks from Japan.
Right.
This idea of committing to a course of action. And they do that in a pretty extreme sense to what we're used to here in the West.
Sure.
Is there a 30-second rundown of how they approach this idea of no excuses and committing to a goal?
So what the marathon monks do at the beginning of the process is they essentially accept the fact that they're going to die. And so they're not going to be able to preserve their life. And because of their willingness to be all in, because of their willingness to totally sacrifice, it allows them to go to a place that most of us don't go to. What most of us do is we spend a lot of energy trying to protect ourselves. We put a lot of energy in trying to not be vulnerable. And I think what the genius of the marathon monks is that when you quit trying to protect yourself and keep yourself alive and just fully invest in something, at that point you're then able to be 100% in. And whenever we get to that point where we can 100% commit ourselves, there is no turning back. Then and only then do we really function at our best. So in other words, for a photographer, if someone said, I'm going to be a photographer, this is what I'm supposed to do, there's no plan B, I'm not going to just try this for a couple of months and then quit, I'm going to commit my whole being to this. It's only when you get to that level that you're really going to be able to perform at your best.
Right. And I was talking to some photographers this week on my strategy session calls that I have with them. And I heard something again this week that I hear quite often, which is, well, I'm working a full-time job at the moment. I do photography as a side job. And I want to, at some point, make photography my full-time living and be able to give up my other job. And then I'll ask them, well, have you set yourself a deadline for this? Have you set some kind of a time scale? And this is where it gets interesting for me, because they say things like, yeah, I think if I could probably do this in a year or 2 years, then yeah, I'll be happy. And I say, well, why don't you set the goal of doing it sooner? Say 6 months or even 3 months. Which of these do you feel more comfortable with? And they go, well, I feel more comfortable saying a year. And well, how do you feel about saying that you're going to make this your full-time business in 3 months? Oh, well, that's really pretty scary. I don't think I can do that.
And you can't, because what you're ultimately competing against is yourself and your own fear. So when you start something from a place of fear, you're not ever going to do it well. So you're talking about, these are people, they say, I want to be a photographer, but I'm afraid that such and such is going to happen. And what I'm saying is that fear is ultimately what's dictating how well they're doing something. And it's only until we overcome the fear and quit playing scared that we're really able to do something to our full ability.
I think for a lot of people, it's easier said than done.
Sure.
Those fears can be pretty compelling.
We are a culture that is so fear-based, we're not even aware of it. It'd be kind of like trying to explain to a fish what the concept of wet is. All they've known is wet. I mean, how would you describe wet to a fish? That's all they've known. But if you think about the culture that most of us Americans have grown up, from the very beginning of our lives, we've been told, be careful, don't get hurt, and watch out. those are all messages of fear. So when you look at people in their careers, what I frequently see is that people, what they'll say is, I'm going to make a smart, conservative business decision. I'm not going to go all in because it would be stupid to quit my job and do this full time. And because of the unwillingness to take that risk, they never get to find out if they could actually do it. What I would tend to more encourage a person to do is to keep doing your job and save up some money and then, kind of go all in with the photography thing. Because if you're not willing to go all in, you're not going to do it well. And I know to some people that sounds like terrible advice, right? Because we're supposed to be careful and not take unnecessary risk. But what I'm suggesting is the people that do great things, that's not how they roll. They take risks that the rest of us go, you're crazy.
Yeah.
You shouldn't do that. It's unwise.
I remember when I was working for a bank back in 99, my background, as a lot of people know, listen to this, is I was a computer programmer for many years. And my last, I guess, full-time employment in that regard was until the end of 99. And that was when I made the jump from being a computer programmer, project manager, sitting behind a desk all day to becoming an underwater photographer in the Egyptian Red Sea, literally overnight. Mm-hmm. And people said to me at the time, are you crazy? You must be mental. You have a great job. You have the security of getting paid every couple of weeks. You get paid very well for what you do. You live in a great place. Why in the world would you just suddenly uproot yourself, move halfway across the planet to a country where you can't speak the language and you've no idea what it is that you're going to be letting yourself in for? I honestly didn't really see it that way at the time. It was just something that I decided that I wanted to do.
Right. For the people listening, there's a difference between I want to do something versus this is what I think I have to do. This is my life's work, my purpose. Because I think there's some people, photography being a hobby is absolutely the way to keep it. But I think for some folks, they come to this realization that this is what I'm on the planet to do. And I think once you have that kind of awareness, in religious circles, they call it a calling, right? Mm-hmm. And my personal belief is there are times when we have a choice to make, and there are other times in our life where we've been chosen. And I think that when you sense that you're chosen to do something, and it could, be a photographer, it could adopt a child or have a child, it could be, move to a foreign country. But I think when you have that realization that you've been chosen to do something, I think if you don't go with it, then you essentially live an unfulfilled life with a lot of regrets. And what I'm suggesting to you is we live in a culture, that's how a lot of people live. And I don't want to encourage people to live that way.
I totally agree with you. I remember thinking back at that time, something like, well, what if they're right? What if this really is a dumb thing to do? But then that only lasted for a brief time because I then sat down and I said to myself, yes, but if I give into that now and I stay here, I'm going to just spend the rest of my time wondering what would have happened had I gone.
Exactly. And, that's the difference between living a life and being alive. There are a lot of people who have life, but they're not really living.
Yeah.
And for me, this whole concept of living a life and fully living it means you do those kinds of things.
To some extent, my reaction to that particular calling, as you put it, probably originated back from when I was a child, and my parents back in the 60s in England had the opportunity at that time to emigrate to Australia, and they had the opportunity to go. And I remember going to these presentations where we would watch movies about people living a great life in Australia, and there was kangaroos and koala bears and pretty birds and such like, and they were showing people doing these great jobs, builders and construction people and nurses and so on. When I talked to them later on in years, they said, yeah, we were ready to go, but we didn't because some family members talked them out of it.
That's
they
right.
said, oh, you must be crazy. Don't go all across the other side of the world. We'll never see you. It'll be like you've gone to another planet and this kind of thing. Well, I remember when I was probably in my early teens, I remember my dad saying to me one day, and maybe he'd been thinking about this because it was just kind of out of the blue, it seemed. I remember him saying to me, if ever you get the opportunity to do something, remarkable or go somewhere and it takes you away from this country, please don't stay here just because of us.
Yeah. And I would say that's an act of love.
Yeah.
If you truly love a person, you encourage them to take those risks. But a lot of people, we're really selfish in our relationships. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so our encouragement, to be careful and don't take any risk is in part because we don't want to have to deal with the consequences if it doesn't go well.
Yeah.
And so it's another form of protecting self. And the point I'm trying to make is that doing great things or doing things really well is not about playing it safe or trying to protect yourself. It's about knowingly and willingly taking some risk. And part of the risk is it may not work out.
Going back to that bank that I mentioned a little while back, their mission statement, and they had this on the wall all over the place, and printed out in pretty letters and so on. We always give 110%. And at the time, I remember thinking, that's a really dumb statement. I can't come to work and give 110%. It's impossible. And I'm pretty sure that they weren't referring to how much interest they paid the people in their bank accounts on their money.
Right.
So this is obviously not a realistic statement, and you make reference to this in the book. Can you elaborate a little bit on that idea?
Yeah, the whole 110% is kind of one of these sports sayings. What they're trying to say is give it everything you have, plus a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, statistically, 100% is all you have. What I find is in sport is that people rarely put forth 100% effort. On occasion they do, but generally not. And most people are given, let's say, 80 to 90% effort, but they think it's 100% because they've never put 100% in, so you don't know what it is. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
If you've never truly spent yourself doing something, then you don't know. And so what I think happens is people who are coaching others or trying to get them to do their best, if you kind of think of the person's given 90% and they think it's all they got, then you're countering that with 110 to try to get to 100. But what I would suggest is even the best of athletes, it's rare that you're at your best physically, that, you're hitting on all cylinders. The fact of the matter is people can be really successful functioning below their best because we're not robots, we're not machines, we're human beings, and we have a lot of fluctuations mentally and physically that affect our ability to fully exert ourselves. I mean, some days you feel well, some days you don't. But to me, it's kind of pep rally talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, the other part's implied is that you need to be a little bit better than you actually are, which I think is also poor advice because you can't be better than you are, but you certainly can do your best. And that's generally the way that, when I work with people, I speak to them is, do you feel like you're doing your best? And they say no. And then we talk about what's keeping them from doing that. But if you can get to a point where you're regularly able to perform at your best, you're going to be wildly successful. And you don't need to be any better than your best because you can't be better than your best.
Right.
If you said to a person, can you be something that you're not? They would say no. Well, trying to be better than you are is the same thing of trying to be something that you're not. And also what's implied is that you aren't enough. And I believe we are. And I think it's the desire to be better than we are that actually keeps us from being at our best.
Yeah, and on those rare occasions where people do operate at 100%, you make reference in the book to the effect that when they hit 100%, it's almost as if it becomes almost effortless. And they're not consciously aware of trying to pump more and more effort into what they're doing. How does that work?
There's two things we need to separate. One is giving effort, and then the other is performance. So if you take something, I work a good bit with golfers. You talk to a professional golfer and say, when you hit the ball, are you swinging as hard as you can? They'll say, no, I'm not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And actually what they figure out is if you swing as hard as you can, there's a good chance that you won't hit it as far. So there's not this direct correlation between effort and outcome. So trying to do something really hard with full effort in certain tasks will actually hinder performance, not help it. So there's a place of effort where you're giving forth a strong effort, but yet you're not straining and you're not kind of distorting yourself. And you have to find out where that is. But generally, when we look at people, say athletes who are performing at a high level, when you observe them, there's an aspect of it that appears effortless. In other words, as you watch them, it doesn't look like they're grunting and groaning and exerting all this effort. I would suggest that probably the same is true for photographers. that if you were to sit and watch an expert photographer work, it wouldn't seem as if it's a difficult task. And their mind is probably focused on one thing and one thing only, and their mind is probably pretty quiet and their body's probably pretty relaxed, but yet the outcome or the result is a very high level. So we live in a culture that basically we believe more is better, more effort is better, more stress and strain is better, longer hours are better, all these kinds of things. And all I'm saying is that hasn't been my experience of the people that I've been around who are the best at what they do. They certainly put forth effort and they're engaged, but they're not grinding themselves down to the nub every day.
With photographers particularly, I feel that they would certainly appear to be expending less energy and effort on a photography assignment when it's something that they are passionately in love with doing as well, because this is another big problem in the photography industry, is that photographers will try to do everything. You'll ask them what their specialty is and they rattle off a whole list of things like, well, I specialize in kids and families and seniors and weddings and commercial stuff and product stuff and events and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
That's not really specializing at all. It's trying to do everything. And then I'll say, well, which of those do you enjoy the most? Oh, well, I don't like weddings. I don't really feel like I can get on with the kids too well or whatever, but I love doing maybe, say, fine art landscapes or something like that. And I say, well, is that where you feel that you're most at ease, you're most calm while you're working? Oh, yeah, I love doing that. It's like being in the zone, as they say. It's like I just get totally immersed in it, and it's like time just evaporates, and you look up, and the next thing you know, it's, several hours have gone by, and you didn't even realize.
That's right.
Whereas you put them in a situation like a wedding, for example, if they're not naturally attuned with doing that type of work, it becomes a real effort, a real uphill battle. It's like they're trying to roll a great big rock uphill.
There's a lot of folks in our culture that they think it's supposed to be that difficult. That if it's not difficult and they're not straining, then they're not doing it hard enough or well enough.
That just reminded me of another thing that happened when I was working in that last job at the bank. I remember one day we had pretty major system failure, and I was in charge of the team responsible for putting this thing right. And basically the customers couldn't get a hold of their money, so it was pretty bad for the bank. And we were sat around the table discussing the problem, how it might have happened, and trying to figure out a potential solution and how to make sure that everything stayed intact. Well, my boss's boss happened to walk past, and he glanced over the top into the little space where the cubicles were, and he had this rather strange look on his face, and he said some swear words and then walked off. And the next thing is my boss comes over to me and he said, can I have a quick word? And I said, sure. I said, what's up? He goes, well, that guy is trying to figure out if we're any closer to getting a solution because he's really upset that the banking system's offline, and he's also telling me that you're not doing anything. And I said, what do you mean? We're trying to figure out the solution. He said, but he said, well, they're not running around like headless chickens, so there's got to be something wrong.
Yeah, exactly. You understand that there's a strong cultural belief for that, that you're supposed to be sweating and huffing and puffing in order to do something at your best or to do it well. And all I'm saying is that part of this whole concept of developing expertise is just the opposite of that when folks really develop a true skill and ability, their mind becomes very quiet when they're doing the task. And of course, if your mind is quiet, your body's going to be quiet. And to another person, you would appear to be relaxed. And you are, but at the same time, you're also functioning at the highest level. And that's just so counter to what so many people have been told about, what you have to do to be successful or do something well.
The last thing that I want to ask you, we talked a little bit about this earlier on in the call, and that is this idea of failure. And another favorite part of the book was at the very end of the book with that great story about Ken. It talks about the only one way to truly fail in the final sense. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the story I tell is one of how they go about selecting guys for the special forces. And of course, the people who are in the special forces, they understand that a large percentage of the missions that you go on are not going to succeed. They're not going to go as planned. And ultimately, what they want to find out in the selection process is, what are you going to do when the mission fails? In other words, What are you going to do when it's not going to go as planned and it really starts falling apart? And they want to see, can you stay engaged? And so the exercise is basically putting guys into a pool and they blow the whistle and you have to go down and touch the bottom of the pool and it's about 15 feet deep and you come back. What happens is ultimately you get to the point where you can't touch the bottom of the pool. And what happens is most guys, when they don't touch the bottom of the pool, they automatically assume that they failed and they just swim over to the side and they get out of the pool. And this is what the vast majority of folks do. Keep in mind, no one told them they failed and no one told them to get out of the pool. They just assume that because the task is when we blow the whistle, swim to the bottom of the pool, touch the bottom, come back up and wait for the whistle again. But what happens is every now and then you'll get a guy, he doesn't make it to the bottom of the pool, but when he comes back up, he still stays in the pool. And when they blow the whistle again, he swims back down as far as he can and usually doesn't get to the bottom again, but essentially doesn't quit. When they get a guy like that, they let him do it a couple times and they stop the exercise. And they keep those guys because they want you to continue to stay engaged and not give up when it's not going well. And what I think most of us do is when we're in the middle of something that's not going well, we just assume ourselves that we have failed. So there's a lot of times, most of the times, no one tells you that you failed. No one tells you that you should quit or stop. You just assume that. And what's interesting is what happens when we don't do that. You know, if I think that it's going to take me a year to get my photography business going, and now it's been a year and a half, I might say, well, I failed. But it's the guy or the woman who's unwilling to say that, who stays engaged, that ultimately has the breakthrough. And you see this in so many professions where we have in our mind, this is the way it's supposed to go, but it doesn't go the way that you think it's supposed to go, and therefore you come to the conclusion that you have failed. And the fact of the matter is, no, it's just not going the way you thought it was going to go.
You know, I think there's a great message there, not just photographers, but anybody in a business, is if the desire is there to do it and you feel as though it's the one thing that you must do, because a lot of the photographers I talk to, I say to them, well, look, how would you feel if somebody walked up to you right now, grabbed your camera bag off you and took your computer and said, you are not allowed to be a photographer anymore. I'm sorry. You're done. How would you feel other than the fact that someone just took your stuff? A lot of them say, I would be absolutely devastated because I can't see myself doing anything else.
And those are the people that should pursue it as a career.
Yeah.
Versus the guy who says, well, that would, be a bummer, but, I guess I would just find something else to do.
Right.
Again, I think that there's a difference between doing something because you want to do it or it's fun versus you're doing something because you've come to the conclusion this is absolutely what I'm here on this planet to do. And I think to do something really well or at a high level, to some degree, you must feel like I was chosen to do this. I was placed here to do this, and therefore I'm going to do it.
Fantastic. Stan, thank you so much. This has been truly wonderful. It's been a real privilege, and I cannot recommend your book highly enough to people who are listening to this, because there are so many truths and so many principles in what you wrote. It's just hard to count. And not only that, you succeeded in creating a book that is incredibly easy to read. I started that book just a couple of days ago, and I finished it. I couldn't put the thing down. I just kept picking it up every time I had a chance to read some more. And I found myself reading sections over and over again, not because I didn't understand them, but because I was so entranced by the message. And I never had any inkling whatsoever that the principles that you had learned in something like sports psychology would have had such a profound application to the type of things that we're doing. So I'm really appreciative, and I'm so glad that you wrote that book, that you answered your own calling. I know you mentioned in there that this was something that you, for a long time, you tried to avoid doing, but I'm glad you actually went ahead and did it.
Well, thank you for those kind words. If people want to follow me on Twitter, I'm on Twitter, and I post pretty regularly just kind of thoughts, ideas, or hallucinations. It's Stan Beecham on Twitter. Then the website is Dr. Stan Beecham, and they can get to the publisher and purchase the book if they want to, or they can get it through Amazon. But I appreciate you having me on and giving me a chance to share some of these thoughts. And I wish you the best with your career, and the people that are listening, I wish them the best with theirs as well.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.